They say money changes people, but I never believed it could erase 28 years of blood, sweat, and sacrifice. Sitting at my own kitchen table, watching my only son stare at me with cold, unfamiliar eyes, I felt the room go completely silent. He slammed a folder of bank statements between us, his voice cutting through the quiet evening like a blunt blade. "You're wasting my money, Dad," he said, each word dripping with condescension. "I work 80 hours a week to fund your lifestyle, and you're just throwing it away. From now on, you don't touch a single dime without my approval." He thought he was the one holding all the cards. He thought he was the provider, and I was just an old, frail man dependent on his charity. What my son didn't realize was that the foundation of his entire life was built on a secret I had kept for nearly 3 decades, a secret that involved the very money he claimed was his. The next morning, I didn't argue. I didn't yell. Instead, I took a single walk down to the local branch, pulled a dusty ledger from a safety deposit box, and set into motion a lesson that would completely shatter his arrogance and change our lives forever. Chapter 1. The Cold Kitchen Table. The silence in the house always felt heavier around 6 o'clock in the evening. For 30 years, that was the time the front door would fly open, the smell of my wife Martha's pot roast would fill the hallway, and our son Julian would drop his backpack with a thud that shook the floorboards. But Martha had been gone for 5 years now, and the house had grown increasingly quiet. The only sound on this particular Tuesday evening was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner and the harsh, rhythmic tapping of Julian's designer leather shoes against the hardwood floor. I sat in my usual chair, the one with the worn-out springs that Martha always promised to fix, but never got around to. Across from me sat Julian. At 32, he looked exactly like a man who believed the world revolved around him. His tailored charcoal suit was immaculate, his hair perfectly gelled, and his smartphone buzzed continuously against the polished oak tabletop. He didn't look at me. He looked at the papers spread out between us like a battlefield. "I don't think you understand the gravity of the situation, Dad," Julian said, his voice flat, devoid of the warmth he used to have when he was a boy trailing behind me in the workshop. "I am the one managing the estate now. I am the one bringing in the revenue. And when I look at these monthly expenditures, I see thousands of dollars simply vanishing. No receipts, no invoices, no explanations." "Julian," I said softly, keeping my hands flat on the table so he wouldn't see the slight tremor in my fingers, a stubborn remnant of my years working the assembly lines and construction sites. "Those expenses are private. They have nothing to do with your firm's earnings." Julian let out a short, mocking laugh, leaning back in his chair. "Private? Dad, your pension barely covers the property taxes on this old mausoleum. The utilities, the groceries, your medical insurance. It's all tied to the family account, the account I generate the capital for. So when you withdraw $3,000 in cash every single month on the first Tuesday, it is my business. You're wasting my money, and frankly, at your age, I need to know if you're being scammed, or worse, if your mind is starting to go." The word "scammed" stung, but the implication that I was losing my faculties cut deeper. I looked at my son, searching for any trace of the boy who used to sit on my lap while we read books about old trains. There was none. In his place was a ruthless corporate accountant, a man who measured human worth strictly by profit margins and balance sheets. "I am not being scammed, Julian, and my mind is perfectly sharp," I replied, my voice steady despite the ache in my chest. "Then prove it," he snapped, leaning forward, placing his palms flat on the table. "Account for the money or I freeze the auxiliary cards tomorrow morning. I'm not funding a black hole anymore. You've had a comfortable life, Dad, but the free ride ends when you start taking advantage of my hard work." He stood up, buttoning his jacket with a swift, practiced motion. He didn't wait for a response. He didn't offer a handshake or a goodbye. He simply picked up his briefcase, walked down the hallway, and let the heavy oak front door slam shut behind him. The vibration rattled the framed photograph of Martha sitting on the mantelpiece. I walked over, straightened the frame, and looked into my wife's painted eyes. "He forgot where he came from, Martha," I whispered to the empty room. "He really forgot." Chapter 2. The Foundations of Clay. To understand how my son became a stranger, you have to understand the ground we built this family on. I spent 40 years as a master carpenter and structural contractor in our small Midwestern town. It wasn't glamorous work. It meant waking up at 4 in the morning when the winter air was so cold it burned your lungs, carrying sheets of drywall up frozen scaffolding, and coming home with hands so calloused they felt like sandpaper. But it paid for this house, and more importantly, it paid for Julian's dreams. When Julian showed an early aptitude for mathematics and business, Martha and I were overjoyed. We didn't want him to have the aching back and stiff joints that plagued my evenings. We wanted him to sit in an air-conditioned office, to wear suits that didn't smell of sawdust and sweat. When he got accepted into a prestigious business school 3 states away, the tuition price tag nearly made my heart stop. "We'll find a way, Arthur," Martha had told me that night, sitting right here at this kitchen table. We always do, and we did. I took on weekend shifts, worked night demolition crews, and mortgaged the house to the absolute limit. Every spare dollar went into an account earmarked for Julian's education and his eventual startup capital. When he graduated, he didn't return home to take over my small contracting business. He stayed in the city, partnered with a few wealthy classmates, and launched an asset management firm. For the first few years, he was grateful. He would call every Sunday, thanking me for the sacrifices. But success is a strange poison. It acts slowly, distorting a person's memory until they believe they climbed the mountain entirely on their own. When his firm took off, Julian took over the management of our family's combined finances, claiming it would optimize our tax structures. I trusted him. He was my son, after all. But then Martha passed away. Her battle with cancer was brief but devastating, and when the dust settled, Julian changed. He stopped looking at this family as a unit of love and started viewing it as an administrative liability. He began referring to the money I had helped him secure as his capital. He spoke about the house as an underperforming asset, and tonight he had finally crossed the line. He had accused me of wasting his money, entirely blind to the fact that the very shoes he stood in were bought with the skin off my knuckles. Chapter 3. The first Tuesday of the month. The next morning the sun rose gray and cold, casting long, pale shadows across my bedroom floor. I woke up at my usual hour, 5 a.m. My joints ached, a familiar morning greeting from a lifetime of hard labor, but my mind was remarkably clear. Julian's words from the previous night kept looping through my head. "You're wasting my money. The free ride ends." Today was the first Wednesday of the month. Yesterday had been the first Tuesday, the day I always made my withdrawal. I made a simple breakfast of black coffee and toast, eating in silence. By 8:30 a.m., I was dressed in my old tweed jacket, the one Martha bought me for our 30th anniversary. It was slightly frayed at the cuffs, but it was clean and respectable. I walked out to my old silver sedan, a car Julian had repeatedly begged me to scrap because it looked bad for the family image, and turned the key. The engine turned over with a comforting, familiar rumble. My destination wasn't the large, glass-fronted corporate bank where Julian kept his firm's accounts. Instead, I drove down to Main Street, where the old brick building of the First Merchants Bank still stood, largely unchanged since 1974. The manager, a man named Thomas, who had gone to high school with my younger brother, smiled as I walked through the heavy glass doors. "Morning, Arthur. You're a day late for your usual routine," Thomas said, leaning over the counter. "Everything all right?" "Everything is fine, Thomas. Just had some family business to tend to yesterday," I replied, offering a polite smile. "I need to access the safety deposit box today, box 412. "Of course. Follow me." Thomas led me down into the basement, through the heavy, reinforced steel door of the vault. The air down here always smelled of old paper, cold metal, and history. He turned his key, I turned mine, and the long metal box slid out of the wall. Thomas gave me a nod and walked out to give me privacy, closing the heavy privacy gate behind him. I sat down at the small wooden table in the center of the vault and lifted the lid of the box. Inside lay several items: Martha's wedding ring, which I couldn't bear to keep in the empty house, the original deed to my property, and a thick, leather-bound ledger with yellowing pages. I opened the ledger. The first entry was dated September 14, 1994. In my own neat, younger handwriting, the line read, "Initial deposit for the Foundation Trust, $10,000. For 30 years, this ledger had been the record of a silent operation. It wasn't an account Julian knew about, not fully. He knew of the trust, but he had long ago assumed it was absorbed into his own corporate funds when he took over the family accounts. He didn't realize that the core of that trust was entirely under my control, protected by clauses he had never bothered to read because he deemed my old legal documents outdated. I pulled out my phone and dialed Julian's direct office line. It went straight to his assistant, a young woman named Clara, who always sounded like she was running a marathon. "Clara, this is Arthur Vance. I need to speak with my son immediately." "Oh, Mr. Vance, Julian is in a high-level portfolio review with our primary investors until noon. Can I take a message?" "Tell him," I said, my voice dropping an octave, "that the black hole just closed. Tell him to meet me at the family home at exactly 1 p.m. If he is late, the consequence will be something his balance sheets cannot fix." I hung up before she could ask any questions. I placed the ledger into my briefcase, locked the safety deposit box, and walked out into the cold morning air. The lesson had officially begun. Chapter 4. The Arrival of the Professional. By 12:45 p.m. I was back in my kitchen. I had placed the leather-bound ledger in the exact center of the table, right where Julian had slammed his bank statements the night before. Next to it, I placed a hot cup of black coffee and a manila envelope I had picked up from my attorney's office on the way home. At exactly 1:02 p.m., tires screeched slightly in the driveway. A car door slammed with an aggressive force. A moment later, the front door unlocked, and Julian marched into the kitchen. He hadn't even taken off his overcoat. His face was flushed with anger, his eyes darting from me to the items on the table. "What is the meaning of this, Dad?" Julian demanded, throwing his car keys onto the counter. "Clara interrupted a multi-million-dollar investor meeting because you gave her some cryptic threat. Do you have any idea how unprofessional that makes me look? I told you last night, we are done with the drama. If you're having a medical episode, we need to get you to a doctor, not play games." "Sit down, Julian," I said calmly, taking a sip of my coffee. "I don't have time to sit down. I have a flight to Chicago at 4 o'clock. I said, "Sit down," I repeated. I didn't raise my voice, but I used the exact tone I used when he was 10 years old and had crossed a line. It was the tone of a father who was still the head of the house, no matter how much money his son made. Julian blinked, surprised by the authority in my voice. He hesitated, then aggressively pulled out the chair opposite me and sat down, crossing his arms tightly over his chest. "You have 5 minutes, Dad. Then I am leaving." "You spent 20 minutes last night telling me I was wasting your money," I began, looking him dead in the eye. "You told me that my mind was going, that I was a burden on your hard work, and that the free ride was over. Do you remember saying those things?" "I was stating financial facts," Julian said defensively. "You're pulling cash out of the account without authorization. As the manager of this family's wealth, I have a fiduciary responsibility to stop it." "The manager of this family's wealth," I murmured, nodding slowly. "That's a grand title for someone who doesn't even know where the foundation stone is buried." I reached forward and pushed the leather-bound ledger toward him. "Open it, page 42. Julian looked at the ledger with disdain. "What is this? Some old carpentry diary?" "Open it, Julian." With an annoyed sigh, he pulled the book closer and flipped through the yellowed pages until he reached the designated section. As his eyes scanned the handwritten entries and the official bank stamps attached to the pages, his posture began to change. The arrogant slouch disappeared. His brow furrowed, and his breath caught slightly in his throat. What? What is this account number? Julian muttered, his voice losing its sharp edge. This isn't our corporate operating account. No, I replied. That is the Vance Foundation Trust, the account that funded your entire Ivy League education, the account that provided the $250,000 in seed money for your firm 7 years ago, the account you always assumed was just a small savings pot I emptied for you. I knew about the trust, Dad, Julian said, trying to regain his footing. But that money was spent years ago. I paid you back tenfold by handling your living expenses and giving you a cut of the firm's dividends. Did you? I asked, leaning forward. Look at the dates, Julian. Look at the balance column on the far right. Julian's eyes traveled down the page. His fingers began to trace the numbers, and I watched as the color slowly drained from his face. The cocky corporate executive was suddenly looking at a reality he hadn't prepared for. Chapter 5. The Ledger's Tale. The ledger didn't lie. For 30 years, every single contract I completed, every weekend job I took, and every piece of land I flipped was recorded in those pages. But there was another column, a column Julian had never seen. It was labeled, The Silent Partner Returns. You think you built your firm on your own merit, Julian? I said, my voice echoing in the quiet kitchen. You think your brilliant mind attracted those early investors. But do you remember your first major client, the Miller Group? The ones who put $5 million into your fund when you were starving in a rented office with 2 folding chairs? Julian looked up, his eyes wide. Of course I remember. Robert Miller. He was a visionary. He saw my proposal and believed in my algorithm. Robert Miller was my best friend from the Navy, Julian, I said softly. And he didn't care about your algorithm. He cared about me. Julian shook his head, a look of total denial washing over his features. No, that's impossible. The Miller Group is an institutional investor. They did their due diligence. They did, I agreed. And their due diligence showed that the Vance Foundation Trust had deposited $3 million into a blind collateral account at First Merchants Bank. That collateral account guaranteed the Miller Group against any losses your firm might incur during your first 3 years of operation. In other words, Julian, your visionary client only invested because I put my entire life savings on the line to catch you if you fell. Julian sat frozen. The ledger opened before him like an indictment. He looked at the bank stamps, the signatures of Robert Miller, and the authorization letters signed by me. His entire narrative of the self-made, brilliant young billionaire was crumbling into dust right in front of him. "Why didn't you tell me?" he whispered, his voice suddenly sounding very young, very small. "Because a father doesn't boast about protecting his son," I said. "I wanted you to have confidence. I wanted you to believe you could fly without looking down at the safety net. But I never expected that safety net to be called a free ride 30 years later." "But what about the $3,000 a month?" Julian asked, his voice shaking as he pointed to the bank statements from the previous night. "The cash withdrawals you've been making? If you have all this money, why are you taking it out of the corporate account?" I looked at the manila envelope sitting on the table. "That brings us to the second part of our lesson, Julian. Because while you were busy counting pennies and feeling superior, you completely forgot to look at what was actually happening right under your nose." Chapter 6. The Hidden Mystery of the First Tuesday. I reached over and opened the manila envelope, pulling out a stack of receipts, photographs, and medical records. I spread them out across the table, covering the bank statements Julian had brought the night before. Every first Tuesday of the month for the past 4 years, I have walked down to the bank, withdrawn $3,000 in cash, and driven 40 miles out of town to the Oak Ridge Care Facility, I explained, pointing to a photograph of a modest, clean brick building surrounded by maple trees. Julian frowned, looking at the photos. "Oak Ridge? That's a specialized nursing home. Why are you going there? Dad, are you sick? Is there something you haven't told me?" "I'm old, Julian, but I'm not sick," I replied. "The person staying at Oak Ridge isn't me. It's Sarah." Julian's face went completely blank. "Sarah? Who the hell is Sarah?" The fact that he didn't remember the name broke my heart all over again. It proved how completely he had detached himself from the reality of our family's history, choosing instead to live in his world of spreadsheets and stock options. Sarah was your mother's younger sister, Julian. Your aunt, I said, my voice tinged with a deep, sorrowful disappointment. The one who lived with us for 2 years when you were a toddler, before she suffered a severe traumatic brain injury in a car accident that took her husband's life. Julian blinked, a distant memory clearly trying to surface through the fog of his corporate life. I remember an Aunt Sarah, but I thought she passed away when I was a kid. Mom told me she went away to a safe place. She went away to a care facility because she required 24-hour supervision, I corrected. Your mother made me promise, the week before she passed away in the hospital, that Sarah would never be abandoned to a state institution. She made me promise that we would always ensure she had the best care, the best room, and the dignity she deserved. And for 5 years I have kept that promise. But why use cash? Julian asked, his analytical mind still trying to find a flaw in the logic. Why not just pay the facility via direct deposit or check from your own account? Why drag it out of the joint family fund? Because of the way you set up the family trust corporate structure, Julian, I said, leaning forward, my voice hardening. When you convinced me to sign over management of the family assets 5 years ago, you inserted a clause that restricted any charitable or non-familial medical disbursements over $500 without joint managerial consent. You told me it was for asset protection. What it actually did was lock me out of my own money to pay for your aunt's care because she isn't legally classified as a direct dependent under your corporate definition. Julian opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. I didn't want to fight you back then, I continued. I was grieving your mother, and I trusted you. So, I found a legal loophole in your own structure. I withdrew the maximum allowed cash allotment each month under personal living expenses, money you thought I was spending on expensive hobbies or wasting, and I hand-delivered it to the director of Oak Ridge to cover the shortfall that her basic insurance didn't touch. Chapter 7. The True Face of Asset Management. I watched my son as the reality of his actions finally sank in. He wasn't just an arrogant man who had insulted his father. He was a man whose cold, calculated systems had actively interfered with a sacred deathbed promise made to his mother. "Dad, I didn't know," Julian stammered, his hands shaking slightly as he looked at the receipts from Oak Ridge. The clauses in the asset management structure. They're standard boilerplate for high net worth protection. I didn't design them specifically to stop you from helping Aunt Sarah. But you didn't care enough to ask, did you? I countered, my voice sharp. You saw a number on a screen, you saw an old man who wasn't generating revenue anymore, and you assumed the worst. You assumed I was a liability. You assumed I was wasting your money. I stood up from the table, walked over to the kitchen window, and looked out at the backyard. The old oak tree we planted when Julian was born was losing its leaves, its branches bare against the gray sky. Yesterday, you told me the free ride was over, I said, keeping my back to him. You told me you were going to freeze the auxiliary cards and demand an audit of my life. Well, Julian, I took you at your word. I spent the morning with our family attorney, Mr. Abernathy, the same attorney who helped me draft the original Vance Foundation Trust. Julian sat up straighter, his corporate defense mechanisms kicking back in. What did you do, Dad? Look, we can fix the structure. I can write an exemption for Oak Ridge. There's no need to involve lawyers. It's already done, Julian, I said, turning around to face him. You see, when I transferred management of the assets to your firm, I didn't transfer ownership. The core capital, the $3 million that is currently serving as the foundational collateral for your firm's primary investment pool at First Merchants Bank, contains a revocation clause. Julian's eyes widened in sheer terror. As a financial manager, he knew exactly what that word meant. A revocation clause based on elder abuse, financial coercion, or unilateral restriction of foundational intent, I stated clearly. By threatening to freeze my accounts yesterday, and by formally accusing me of financial incompetence without cause in front of witnesses. Your assistant Clara heard your phone call to me today, and my attorney has a recorded log of your previous emails. You triggered the clause. Dad, no, Julian gasped, standing up so fast his chair rattled against the floor. You can't do that. If you withdraw that collateral, First Merchants Bank will immediately pull our credit facility. The Miller Group will be legally required to review their position, and my firm's rating will drop to junk status by Friday morning. You'll ruin me. I won't ruin you, Julian, I said calmly, looking at my watch. You ruined yourself the moment you forgot that money isn't a measure of a man's power. It's a measure of his responsibility. Chapter 8. The Falling Dominoes. The kitchen phone rang, its old-fashioned bell cutting through the thick tension of the room like a siren. Julian jumped at the sound. He looked at the phone, then at me, his face pale and sweating. Go ahead, I said, gesturing toward the wall-mounted unit. That's likely your office. Julian stumbled over to the phone, pulling the receiver off the hook with a trembling hand. Hello? Julian here. I couldn't hear the voice on the other end, but I could see the exact moment the corporate empire he had built on clay began to fracture. His eyes darted around the room, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. What do you mean, Thomas called? From First Merchants? No, tell him it's a misunderstanding. Clara, listen to me. Call a board meeting for 3 o'clock. No, don't stall them. Julian slowly lowered the receiver, his arm dropping to his side. He looked at me, a mixture of disbelief and utter desperation in his eyes. The bank just issued a formal notice of collateral review, Julian whispered, his voice cracking. They're freezing our secondary trading line until you sign a verification statement. Dad, please. My whole life is in that firm. Everything I've worked for since I left college. You can't just take it away because of an argument. It wasn't an argument, Julian, I said, walking back to the table and picking up the leather-bound ledger. It was an audit. You wanted a full accounting of where the money goes, and you got it. Now, it's time for you to see what happens when the man who built the foundation decides to step away. What do you want from me? Julian cried out, his corporate composure completely shattered. He was no longer the high-powered executive. He was a desperate man facing the consequences of his own arrogance. Do you want an apology? I'm sorry I said those things last night. I'm sorry about Aunt Sarah. I'll pay for her care myself out of my personal salary. Just call the bank, please. I looked at my son, feeling a profound mixture of love and sorrow. An apology doesn't fix a broken foundation, Julian. You need to understand the true cost of things. Pack your things. We're going for a drive. A drive? Dad, I have an investment crisis happening right now. Your investment crisis can wait, I said, picking up my car keys. Because if you don't get in that car with me right now, the next call I make to Mr. Abernathy won't be for a review. It will be for a total liquidation. Chapter 9. The Road to Oak Ridge. The drive out of town was completely silent. Julian sat in the passenger seat of my old sedan, his phone buzzing every 30 seconds with urgent emails and text messages from his partners, his assistant, and his compliance officers. For the first 10 miles, he kept trying to type out responses, his fingers flying across the screen in a panicked frenzy. Turn it off, Julian, I said softly, keeping my eyes on the highway. Dad, I can't just... Turn it off. With a frustrated groan, he pressed the power button and shoved the phone into his pocket. He stared out the side window as the city landscape faded into wide, open farmlands and rolling hills. The gray autumn afternoon was turning colder, with the first few flakes of early snow beginning to drift against the windshield. As we drove, I watched him through the rearview mirror. I could see the gears turning in his head. He was trying to figure out a financial strategy, a loophole, a way to restructure his liabilities to bypass his old father. He still thought this was a game of chess, a corporate power struggle where the person with the cleverest lawyer wins. We finally turned down the long, tree-lined driveway of the Oak Ridge Care Facility. The old brick building looked warm and inviting against the bleak winter sky, light spilling out from the large common room windows. "Why are we really here, Dad?" Julian asked, his voice quiet, almost exhausted. "To guilt-trip me? To show me the person I supposedly tried to harm?" "No," I replied, pulling into a parking spot and turning off the engine. "To show you the difference between an asset and a life. Come inside." We walked through the front doors, the smell of lavender and fresh-baked cookies instantly enveloping us. The facility didn't feel like a sterile hospital, it felt like a home. The staff greeted me by name, offering warm smiles and nods as we walked down the clean, carpeted hallway toward the residential wing. We stopped outside room 114. Through the small glass pane in the door, I could see a woman sitting in a rocking chair by the window, a thick wool blanket over her lap. Her hair was completely silver, but her face was remarkably smooth, her eyes staring out at the falling snow with a peaceful, quiet serenity. It was Sarah. "She doesn't know who I am, does she?" Julian asked, his voice barely a whisper as he looked through the glass. "No," I said. "Her short-term memory has been gone for 20 years. She remembers the music of her youth. She remembers her sister Martha, and she knows that when I visit, she is safe. But she doesn't know about portfolios or algorithms or corporate structures. She just knows whether she is warm, fed, and loved." I turned to look at my son. "The $3,000 a month you called a waste doesn't buy her luxury, Julian. It buys her this window. It buys her the nurse who brushes her hair every morning with patience. It buys her the dignity your corporate spreadsheet decided wasn't cost-effective." Chapter 10. The Meeting of Two Worlds. I pushed the door open gently. "Sarah, look who came to visit today." The woman turned her head slowly, her pale blue eyes lighting up with a faint instinctive recognition when she saw me. "Arthur," she said, her voice soft and slightly raspy. "You brought the cold inside with you." "Just a little bit of snow, Sarah," I smiled, walking over and kissing her cheek. "I brought someone with me today. Do you remember Julian?" Sarah looked past me to where Julian stood just inside the doorway. He looked completely out of place in his tailored suit, his shoulders tense, his hands nervously gripping the edges of his coat pockets. Sarah stared at him for a long, agonizing moment, her brow furrowed as her mind tried to bridge the gap across 3 decades of lost time. Then, a small smile broke across her face. "The boy who loved the trains," she whispered, her voice filled with a sudden, beautiful clarity. "Martha's little boy. You grew up so big." Julian froze. I saw a visible shudder pass through his frame. The corporate armor he had worn for years, the cold barrier he used to protect his ego and his wealth, completely shattered with those few words. He looked at his aunt, a woman he had written off as an administrative irrelevance, and saw a piece of his own mother looking back at him. "Yes, Aunt Sarah," Julian choked out, stepping forward, his voice thick with emotion. "It's me. It's Julian." He sat down on the small wooden stool next to her rocking chair, his long legs cramped, his expensive suit trousers pressing against the linoleum floor. Sarah reached out a frail, trembling hand, her fingers gently touching his face, tracing his jawline just like his mother used to do when he was a child. "You look just like her," Sarah murmured, her eyes misting over. "Martha always said you'd do great things. She was so proud of you." Julian couldn't hold it back anymore. A single tear escaped his eye, tracking down his cheek, followed by another. He leaned his head forward, letting his forehead rest gently against his aunt's hand, his shoulders shaking silently as years of buried family history, guilt, and suppressed emotion finally came pouring out. I stepped back into the hallway, pulling the door shut behind me to give them privacy. I stood against the wall, listening to the quiet murmur of their voices through the wood. I knew the lesson wasn't over yet, but the foundation had finally begun to shift. Chapter 11. The Condition of Restoration. An hour later, Julian walked out of the room. His eyes were red, His tie was slightly loosened, and the arrogant, superior posture he had carried into my kitchen that afternoon was completely gone. He looked like a man who had finally woken up from a long, self-absorbed dream. "She fell asleep," Julian said, wiping his face with a handkerchief. She kept talking about Mom. She remembered things I forgot decades ago, Dad. She remembered the time we built that wooden fort in the backyard. "The mind is a strange thing, Julian," I said, handing him a cup of coffee from the waiting room dispenser. "It forgets the data, but it remembers the love." We walked out to the parking lot, the snow now dusting the hood of my sedan with a thin layer of white. Julian didn't reach for his phone. He didn't ask about the bank or the investors. He just stood there in the cold air, looking up at the sky. "What happens now, Dad?" he asked, his voice steady but humbled. "Are you going to liquidate the trust? Are you going to close the firm?" I leaned against the side of the car, looking at my only child. "That depends entirely on you, Julian. I didn't trigger that clause to destroy your life. I triggered it to save your soul. I didn't spend 40 years breaking my back to build a successful son, only to watch him turn into a monster who counts pennies while his family starves for affection." I pulled the manila envelope out of my jacket and handed it to him. "Inside this envelope is a new management agreement drafted by Mr. Abernathy. It restores your firm's access to the collateral trust, but it comes with 3 non-negotiable conditions." Julian took the envelope, looking at it with a quiet reverence. "Name them." "First," I said, holding up a finger, "the Vance Foundation Trust is completely separated from your corporate structure permanently. It will be managed by an independent trustee, and its primary disbursement will be the lifetime care of your Aunt Sarah and any other charitable endeavors I see fit. You will never look at its ledger as a liability again." "Agreed," Julian said without a second thought. "Second," I continued, "you will resign your position as the sole manager of my personal finances. My pension, my house, and my cash are mine. If I choose to spend every dollar on old wood and train models, you will smile and ask if I need help carrying the boxes." Julian offered a small, sad smile. "Done. What's the third condition?" I looked at him, my heart aching with a profound fatherly love. "The third condition is that you come to dinner every single Sunday. No phone, no business partners, no corporate talk. You will sit at that kitchen table. You will eat whatever simple meal I cook, and you will remember what it means to be a son. You will remember where you came from." Julian looked down at the envelope, then up at me, his eyes filling with tears once again. He stepped forward and did something he hadn't done since he was a teenager. He threw his arms around my neck, hugging me tightly, burying his face in my old tweed jacket that smelled of sawdust and home. "Thank you, Dad," he whispered. "Thank you for not giving up on me." Final life lesson. The next morning, the financial markets opened, the collateral was verified, and Julian's firm stabilized without a single investor ever knowing how close they had come to the edge of the cliff. But inside the walls of his glass-fronted office, things had changed. Julian had a new photograph on his desk, an old faded picture of his mother, his father, and his Aunt Sarah sitting on the porch of our old house. Money is a powerful tool, but it is a terrible master. It has the ability to make us blind to the very sacrifices that allowed us to acquire it in the first place. True wealth isn't measured by the balance in a corporate account or the status of a stock portfolio. It is measured by the strength of the promises we keep and the love we protect when no one else is watching. I taught my son a lesson he'd never forget, not by matching his arrogance with anger, but by showing him that the structures we build in life are only as strong as the integrity of their foundations. And now, every Sunday at 6 o'clock, the heavy oak front door of my house flies open, a briefcase is set down gently, and the silence is replaced by the most valuable sound in the world, the voice of my son coming home.